You felt it your whole life. That invisible wall between you and the world. The lingering sense that you were born into a reality that doesn't quite speak your language. You walk through crowds, smile in conversations, nod in meetings. But deep down, you feel like a ghost in someone else's dream. There's a weight in your chest. A quiet ache. Not because you're broken, but because you see what others refuse to see. You feel what others numb. You question what others blindly accept. And for that, you've been rejected. Not always directly. Sometimes it's subtle. A friend slowly pulls away. A partner says you're too intense. A group excludes you without explanation. Or maybe it's more brutal. Laughed at for your ideas. Dismissed for your depth. Punished for your truth. But it always leaves the same wound. Why does being myself feel so unsafe? Carl Jung had an answer. One that few have truly dared to face. He believed that when an individual begins to walk the path of individuation, the journey of becoming one's full, authentic self, they do not just encounter inner resistance. They awaken the shadows of everyone around them. Because when you shine a light on your truth, you unconsciously expose the lies others are still clinging to. And for many, that's unbearable. Jung warned that society is not built for the self, it's built for the ego, for the mask, for the obedient persona who knows their place, follows the script, and asks no questions. The moment you step outside that script, the world tightens its grip. Why? Because your freedom threatens their illusion. And this is where the story of the chosen one begins. Not in power, but in pain. Not in recognition, but in rejection. Jung saw this rejection not as failure, but as a signpost. A spiritual signal that you are nearing the edges of the collective's comfort zone. And when you cross that line, you become a mirror. Not a flattering one. You mirror everything others have buried. The dreams they gave up on. The pain they refused to heal. The truths they traded for safety. They don't consciously know this. But the unconscious always knows. And so they project. They turn their discomfort into judgment. Their envy into criticism. Their fear into control. You become too much. Too deep. Too sensitive. Too different. But none of those words are really about you. They're about the parts of them that your presence unsettles. This is what Jung called shadow projection. The disowned parts of ourselves, our fears, wounds, desires, don't vanish. They simply get projected onto others. And the one who dares to live authentically, they become the perfect screen. You didn't choose to carry this, but you were chosen the moment you refused to betray yourself. That refusal makes you dangerous. Not because you seek power, but because you no longer fear truth. And in a world built on denial, truth is the greatest threat of all. Jung believed that individuation, the full development of the self, requires a kind of death. The death of conformity, the death of blind belonging, the death of external validation. And most people aren't ready to die. So when they see someone walking through that fire, someone like you, they flinch, they retreat, or worse, they attack. They mistake your awakening for arrogance, your authenticity for rebellion, your purpose for delusion. But what they're really seeing is what they lost in themselves. You become a living reminder of everything they were too afraid to become. And so the chosen one becomes the exiled one. This has always been the way. From ancient prophets to mystics, artists, and revolutionaries, those who see too much, feel too deeply, or speak too honestly, are often cast out before they are ever understood, because the chosen one's journey threatens the system. Not just political or religious systems, but psychological ones. The ego doesn't want to be dethroned. The shadow doesn't want to be seen. The collective doesn't want to change. And yet, something in you cannot be silenced. Something in you remembers. A flame that flickers, even in your darkest nights. A knowing that whispers, I came here for more than this. That's not delusion. That's calling. But here's the part they never tell you. The calling doesn't come with applause. It comes with loneliness. With long nights of doubt. With silence so thick, it drowns your certainty. And still you keep going. Because something deeper than approval is guiding you. This is the paradox of the chosen one. You are rejected not because you're unworthy, but because your very presence threatens to awaken. And awakening is rarely welcomed. People want comfort, not transformation. Familiarity, not truth. Pleasure, not depth. And you bring the storm. Because the self does not arrive gently. It crashes through illusion. It burns away the false. It demands integration. Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And when they see you facing yours, they panic, because your courage reminds them of their cowardice. Your clarity shatters their confusion. Your light exposes their shadows. This isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility to not become bitter, to not shrink yourself, to not dim your fire just to be tolerated. The chosen one walks a narrow path, not above others but within themselves. They are not chosen to dominate. They are chosen to remember the soul beneath the skin, the truth beneath the trauma, the self beneath the persona. And in remembering, they become a light, not always a comforting one, but a clarifying one. You weren't born to fit in. You were born to illuminate. And the world may resist you for it, but the soul will recognize you. Always. So what does it actually look like to walk through the world as a chosen one, with a soul that remembers, and a psyche that sees too much? It often starts in childhood, not with glory, but with disorientation. You feel things no one talks about. You notice lies no one admits. You ask questions no one wants to answer, while others seem content to obey. You pause, hesitate, sense that something's off. This isn't defiance. It's perception. Your nervous system is tuned differently. Your psyche is already reaching into layers. Others won't dare explore for decades, if ever. You may have been called a problem child. Too sensitive, too intense, too dramatic. But Carl Jung would say, you weren't problematic. You were already in contact with the self. He believed that the self, the archetype of wholeness, is not something you create, but something you uncover. It whispers beneath the noise. It breaks through in dreams, art, strange intuitions. And for some, those who carry the archetype of the wounded healer, or the old soul, or the outsider, the self starts knocking early. But this awareness, this early sensitivity, comes at a cost. You see too much, but you lack the tools to understand what you're seeing. So you internalize it. You start believing that the problem is you. This is where the first fracture happens. The child begins to split, a part that feels true and a part that feels safe, and the world always rewards the latter. Smile when you're scared, nod when you're confused, conform when your soul is screaming. And so the persona is born. Jung defined the persona as the social mask we wear, the acceptable version of ourselves we present to the world. It's not inherently bad, but for the chosen one, it becomes a prison, because you're not just faking politeness. You're suppressing truth. You know who you are, but you've learned to hide it, and that hiding slowly becomes self-rejection. Years pass. You get better at performing. You blend in. You say the right things. You learn how to smile while dying inside. But the self doesn't forget. It waits, patiently, until one day it erupts. Maybe it's a breakdown, a heartbreak, a job you can't force yourself to keep, an identity crisis that tears through your comfortable lies. And suddenly, you remember. You remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And you realize you never belonged because you weren't meant to belong. You were meant to wake up. But this is the part most people don't understand. Awakening is not blissful at first. It's violent. It rips away illusions. It floods you with grief. It forces you to confront how much of your life was a performance. You may lose friends, lose your job, lose your sense of identity. But what you gain is reality. And in that raw, terrifying, sacred clarity, you see the world for what it is. Beautiful, broken, brilliant, blind. And you realize something even deeper. The world doesn't just reject the chosen one out of fear. It rejects them out of necessity, because the chosen one's presence challenges the collective dream. It forces others to confront their shadow. The shadow is Jung's term for all the unconscious parts of the self. Our rejected instincts, our unclaimed power, our unprocessed pain. And when someone lives in alignment with their soul, it shines a light on that shadow. People don't see you. They see the parts of themselves they've buried. Your freedom, it makes them feel trapped. Your depth, it exposes their avoidance. Your truth, it threatens their denial. So they reject you, not because you're wrong, but because you're real. And realness is disruptive. This is the loneliness of the chosen one. Not because no one loves you, but because few can see you. You become fluent in silence. You learn to walk with questions that have no easy answers. You stop expecting understanding and start cultivating inner knowing. And eventually, that knowing becomes your compass. You realize you're not here to be liked. You're here to be true. You're not here to maintain harmony at the cost of your soul. You're here to birth a new kind of harmony, one rooted in authenticity. And slowly, the exile becomes sacred. You find beauty in your solitude, strength in your silence, power in your presence. You stop chasing belonging and start embodying it, because the most powerful thing a chosen one can do is stop waiting for the world to understand them, and instead build the world within, that they were born to carry. The world may still misunderstand you, but your soul never will. And when you begin to walk in alignment with that soul, you magnetize others who are on the same frequency. Not the masses, but the mirrors. Those rare souls who don't just tolerate your truth. They recognize it. They don't flinch at your depth. They resonate with it. And in those sacred connections, you remember, you were never truly alone. You were simply ahead. But what happens when the chosen one doesn't listen? What happens when you do feel the call, but instead of answering it, you deny it? You pretend it's not there. You numb it with distractions. You silence it with perfectionism, people-pleasing, overworking, spiritual bypassing. You become an actor in your own life, playing roles that keep everyone else comfortable. And for a while it works. You keep the peace. You get the approval. You blend in just enough to avoid the sting of rejection. But inside, something starts to rot. Carl Jung warned that the self does not go away simply because you ignore it. It waits, in the shadow, and the longer you deny it, the more violently it demands your attention. This is where the chosen one begins to suffer. Not because of the world, but because of the war within. The self begins to sabotage the persona, not out of malice, but out of desperation. It's like a soul that's suffocating, and so it screams through symptoms. Anxiety that comes out of nowhere, depression that no amount of gratitude fixes, fatigue that sleep can't cure, addictions, compulsions, relationships that repeat the same painful pattern. You try to fix it on the surface, change your job, change your diet, change your location. But nothing sticks, because the issue isn't out there. It's in here. The pain is a message, and the message is clear. You cannot betray yourself and expect to thrive. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's what you've been avoiding. Because to accept yourself completely, you must confront the parts you've disowned. The grief, the rage, the envy, the power. Yes, especially the power. Because here's the hidden truth about chosen ones. Most don't fear failure. They fear their greatness. They fear what will happen if they stop dimming, if they speak their truth, if they walk away from the life they were taught to settle for. Because they know deep down that to live in alignment with the self requires sacrifice. You can't take everyone with you. You can't keep every relationship. You can't keep playing small and still grow wings. And so many chosen ones delay their awakening. They stall, negotiate, try to find a middle ground between authenticity and acceptance. But eventually, the pressure becomes unbearable, and the breakdown begins. This is the dark night of the soul, the point where everything starts falling apart, not to punish you, but to purge everything that was never truly yours. Jung didn't romanticize this process. He knew it was brutal, terrifying, lonely, but he also knew it was necessary, because when the false self begins to collapse, you finally have a chance to meet the real one. Not the one shaped by expectation, but the one born from essence. And that meeting, that moment when the soul finally steps forward, it changes everything. You begin to realize the rejection you feared so deeply was never as painful as the self-abandonment you endured daily. The love you chased from others was a substitute for the love you withheld from yourself. And the power you tried to suppress was never meant to be buried. It was meant to lead. But this realization comes with grief. Grief for the years lost in hiding. Grief for the parts of you that were silenced. Grief for the versions of yourself that had to be abandoned to survive. This grief is sacred. Don't rush it. Don't bypass it. It is the soil where your true self takes root. And as you begin to honor that grief, you start to reclaim your energy. You stop leaking your power to roles, masks, and expectations. You stop contorting to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you. You stop begging to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You realize you were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to be understood by yourself. And in doing so, you give the world something rare. A human being who has integrated their shadow, who has walked through fire, who no longer needs to perform to be worthy. That's the power of the chosen one. Not perfection, not spiritual superiority, but radical authenticity, a willingness to be exactly who you are, even if the world still prefers the mask. Because once you've faced your own darkness, you no longer fear the projections of others. You recognize them for what they are, reflections of their pain, not judgments of your worth. This is liberation. The chosen one becomes unshakable, not because they control the world, but because they no longer need it to validate them. They walk with clarity, with conviction, with compassion, because they know what it's like to be lost, and they know what it takes to return home to the self. So what does it mean to return to the self? To walk through fire, through grief, through exile, and emerge with clarity? Carl Jung didn't promise enlightenment through shortcuts. He didn't offer affirmation or instant healing. What he offered was integration. The chosen one's path is not about becoming something more. It's about reclaiming what's been forgotten. Piece by piece, wound by wound, you collect the fragments of your soul that were scattered by shame, rejection, and fear. You sit with the younger you, the one who was too much, too sensitive, too honest. And you say, you weren't too much. You were too true for a world still asleep. This is the real shadow work. Not aesthetics, not journaling your way into control, but surrendering to the raw, aching truth of who you are, to the brilliance you feared, to the rage you buried, to the love you never gave yourself. And from that surrender comes power, because you are no longer fragmented. You are no longer playing parts. You are no longer trying to be digestible. You are whole, and wholeness doesn't need validation. It becomes its own gravity. Others feel it, in your presence, in your eyes, in your silence. You no longer shout to be heard. You simply are, and that being transforms every room you walk into. This is the paradox Jung understood. The more you embrace your individuality, the more you awaken the collective. Your healing is not selfish. It is contagious. Every chosen one who chooses their self becomes a beacon for those still hiding. You don't need to convince. You don't need to convert. You just need to embody. Because when someone who has walked through their own hell still chooses love, still speaks truth, still lives with presence, it shifts people, without force, without noise, just by being what most have forgotten is possible. That's your power now, not in proving your worth, but in living as if it were never in question. And make no mistake, the world will still reject you. The unconscious doesn't go down quietly. Society still runs on conformity. Collective shadow still projects onto those who dare to evolve. But rejection no longer breaks you, because you're not living for acceptance. You're living for alignment, and that alignment makes you unstoppable. Yes, you'll still feel lonely at times. Yes, you'll still have to grieve what was lost. But you'll never be confused again about who you are or why you're here. You're here to remember. You're here to remind others. You're here to live a life that honors your soul, instead of betraying it. And in doing that, you become the very thing the world said you could never be. Free, not in a fantasy way, but in a grounded, embodied, unshakable way. You're no longer the exile. You are the return, and your return heals more than just you. It sends a ripple through the collective unconscious. It tells the others, those still hiding, still doubting, that it's safe to come home, to their power, to their truth, to their shadow, to their self. Carl Jung didn't write for the masses. He wrote for the ones like you, the ones who couldn't look away, the ones who couldn't pretend, the ones who couldn't shrink into something false. He knew your path would be painful. He knew your awakening would cost you, but he also knew it would be worth it, because the world doesn't change through imitation. It changes through individuation. And every time you choose that path, you carve a trail for someone else to follow. So walk it fully, walk it boldly, walk it imperfectly, but never walk it halfway. You are not broken. You are becoming. Not what the world expects, but what your soul remembers. And if you've made it this far, then you know, the rejection was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of your return. Now walk forward, not to explain yourself, but to express yourself. Live the life your shadow once feared, and yourself always knew was possible. You were never just rejected. You were being redirected to the only place that ever mattered. Back to you. Subscribe to the Awakened Compass and join our membership to unlock the full journey within.